But calling is not just 9 to 5, as I like to say, it's also 5 to 9, right? Calling is whole life. It's not just what I do at my job. That's your occupation. Okay, so we're going to jump into chapter 2, calling as vocational worship. And to start it off, I want us to think about a simple idea that there are two aspects of calling, or two kinds of calling, if you will, primary and secondary. This is really important for us to get clear on the terms. But let me, I don't know, I guess we can just do this together. Those four terms, occupation, profession, vocation, and calling, the first thing we should note is that the word vocation and calling are literally the same word, just from different roots. If you notice that the word vocation comes from vocare, which just means to call in Latin. So like vocal, to call, right? So calling and vocation are the same. So just to save some embarrassment for ourselves, generally speaking, we should avoid the term like this, as my mentor says, I want to find out my vocational calling. That just means I'm looking for my calling, right? So they're literally synonyms from different languages, okay? So let's keep those clear. Vocation and calling are quite the same word, or they have the same meaning. And if you think about it, even the word profession, these are very Christian terms. Think about the word profession. Where do you think that comes from? Yeah, to profess something, right? It has to do with the faith. So these are all very Christian terms. But now you just say, hey, what's your profession, right? Just as a side note, like professors were the only ones at a time that were called doctors, because doctors are people who taught the doctrines of the church. So they taught doctrine, and then they are professors, so they profess the faith. But nowadays, the only real doctors are medical ones, and we are the fake doctors, and we're just professors. Whatever. But you get the idea, right? So in other words, our career is part of our calling, but our callings are always greater than our careers. Are you guys with me? We spend 40 years and 40 hours a week with our career, but calling is not just 9 to 5, as I like to say, it's also 5 to 9, right? Calling is whole life. It's not just what I do at my job. That's your occupation. So occupation is career. Career is 40 hours, 40 years, but calling is whole life. Okay, and we'll get that? Primary calling is our calling, it's always our calling to Christ. We are always first and foremost called to be a disciple of Him. So Mark 8:34, then He, Jesus, called the crowd to Himself, or to Him, along with His disciples, and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself and take up the cross and follow me, right? Our primary calling is always to Christ. But we have a secondary calling, which is our calling from Christ, right? We should always keep the primary and the secondary. Meaning, again, I'll refer to him a lot. You've already seen him in the book, I believe, but a mentor of mine, Oz Guinness, he and his wife, Jenny, no matter how... So Oz is like the busiest man in the world, I told you, that I personally know, right? He's the guy who will literally be preaching at a church of 30 people in San Salvador, in El Salvador, and then he'll fly over to the UN in Geneva, and then he'll go over to Congress, and that's just in the afternoon. You know what I'm saying? And then the next day, just that's his life. But 30 minutes in the Word and 30 minutes in prayer is how he and Jenny spend every single day, no matter how busy, no matter where they are in the world. Sometimes together, sometimes apart. But in other words, Oz has always realized that primary calling is always to the Lord. He's called to be a disciple, learn of His way, and then get busy and go on CNN and give an interview about X, Y, and Z. Does that make sense? So it's always primary before, it's Mary before Martha, in other words, right? It's Mark 8:34 before 2 Corinthians 5:17. So what does that say? Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Okay, so we all know that. We're in Christ, we're new, but He's also given us a ministry of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassador. As though God were making His appeal through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. there's these three things, and I think they kind of all feed into each other. The first is pre-evangelism, the second is evangelism, and the third is post-evangelism. Here's what we mean. Roman Catholics have this term called the evangelization of culture. It's something that I think Protestants can learn something from, where basically they're saying that evangelism is not just about human souls, it's also about music studios and production companies and biology textbooks. We're supposed to evangelize culture, not just people. And so Protestants might be more familiar with the term pre-evangelism. So what's the idea? Our pre-evangelism has everything to do with impacting culture, right? Evangelism has to do with what, obviously? If you were to go for another C word. Evangelism is all about? Okay, good, yeah, Christ, Christianity. And then once you are saved, right, once evangelism has happened and you've accepted the good news, the evangel, right? In post-evangelism, what happens? What's the third C? This should be no surprise. Yes. Good. Brilliant, right? Calling. C.S. Lewis, he writes his Narnia series, and then he gives a talk at a church in London, and a lady comes up to him and says, Mr. Lewis, with all due respect, you're a Christian professor at Oxford. Why didn't you write a Christian children's book series? Right? And then he said back to her, with all due respect, ma'am, I did. And here's the language he didn't use, but here's the ideas he's saying. He said, I wrote a book so that when they were to read it or hear it, when they're 5 years old, they would encounter what I might call the visual gospel, so that when they're 25 years old and they heard the verbal gospel, it would make sense to them, right? It would resonate with them. You guys following that? So C.S. Lewis wrote books that didn't say John 3:16 in every chapter, but he wrote books so that he would paint the visual gospel. He was doing pre-evangelism, so that when the evangelism actually happens, these folks would understand the verbal gospel because they've encountered the visual gospel for now 20 years, right? So the question is this: once you come to Christ and He's given you your secondary calling, how do you take your calling, and if you do it well, what will it feed into? Right? So there's this cyclical thing going on where the visual gospel leads to the verbal gospel, which then leads to your discipleship to Christ, as well as your ambassadorship for Christ. You guys getting that? So you're called to be a disciple, right? Primary calling, right? We're always going to, it's Oz Guinness and his wife, 30 minutes in the Word, 30 minutes every day in prayer, right? That's our primary calling, going to Christ to be a disciple. But then, not only are we called to Christ, but we have a calling from Christ. And some of you are called to be an ambassador in Hollywood. Others of you are called to be ambassador by raising 3 kids. Others of you guys are called to be ambassador in the world of engineering. But we're all first called to be disciples, and secondly, called as an ambassador. And as all of you just pointed out, pre-evangelism feeds to evangelism. Evangelism results in, hopefully, your calling, your post-evangelism. And when you do that well, like C.S. Lewis did, then there is a feeding back into pre-evangelism. And I like to call this like the kingdom circle. And by the way, this is why I love people like Lewis, or again, I'll point to someone like Steph Curry, right? Because I like how when Steph Curry, in a post-game interview, there was one time, did I share this here? I don't think I did, right? No, okay. So Steph Curry, and I'll bring him into class in a couple of weeks just to kind of, no, I'm just kidding. But like, but you guys are like, oh man, now my tuition's worth it. But he in his post-game interviews, this lady, this journalist, right, sports journalist, she was like interviewing him, and she was a Christian, like newscaster. She was like trying to get Steph to say like God. She goes, so what is the reason why you excelled so much in tonight, like 41 points? How'd you do that, right? Like, what motivates you? And then he goes, well, my coach. I love my coach, and we have a great relationship, and he pushes me hard, and I like to push hard because that's what my work is all about here on the court, right? And then she goes, yeah, but surely there's some other reason that you do what you do, because we all know, right, Steph is a Christian, right? And then he's all, another reason? I mean, it's my teammates, right? I love them, and we're just strong, and that's what being a team means, and you just go off for each other, right? And she's like, no, I mean, like, there must be a higher, like, bigger, like, transcendent, she's like gunning for it. And then he goes, and then it wasn't even him, Aisha, his wife, grabs the mic and he goes, it's because he loves Jesus, okay? Like, it kind of broke the ice. It was kind of funny, a little bit awkward. But the point is that Steph doesn't necessarily feel obligated, right, to always say, well, it's my faith in Jesus Christ, though sometimes he does, right? Like the MVP speech from like 3 years ago, like he that's the first thing he said. But he would rather, as it were, put it on the court and just paint the visual gospel with excellent sportsmanship and all the rest. And then occasionally, when it's appropriate, right, do the verbal gospel. One thing I do want to point out is calling is not just like, let me find my field and flourish and crush it or whatever. But in Romans, the rest of Romans 12, take a look. It's not just like, what am I supposed to do because of my why? It's also, if you look at the rest of the passage, calling involves, I think, it involves integrity and zeal and forgiveness and a lot of other things, right? The way I like to put it is calling is about our vocation as well as our virtues. It's about, right, crushing it, but it's also about character. Let's have any questions. I know I've given you guys a lot. Any questions whatsoever from last time or this time? And that's a great question, Josh. I think it's probably, that's great. It's probably somewhat of a reaction to the previous generation. Let me put it this way. We are increasingly going into, at least from what we can see now, a post-Christian world. I don't usually like that term because that means we're kind of given up, we're on the defensive. But largely speaking, we have gone from a world in which, let's just talk about America in particular, right? There was a good majority of Christians who were both visible and vocal, but now that's dwindling. And so when we present the verbal gospel, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to people. Because when you say sin, hell, heaven, resurrection, right, and glorification, people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? But if they watch Lord of the Rings, or if they watch the Narnia series, or you get the idea, and they see such themes like redemption and good and evil and a Christ figure coming through and so forth, then there is this, at least there's this environment in which people can make sense of the verbal a little bit better, right? Now, there might be, let me follow up and then feel free, Josh, but there might be this sense where it's kind of true, like maybe sometimes we're always swinging on the pendulum, right? Maybe so many of us are so afraid to speak up about the verbal that we need to encourage that more. So I totally get that. And maybe that's where a lot of us are now. But I do believe that unless we have some sort of environment in which verbal gospel stuff even makes sense, we can there's a quote by the late John Machen Gresham, who says, he was the president of Princeton. He said, you can preach with all the fervor of a reformer and struggle to win a straggler here or there if you let the whole collective thought of a nation be ruled by false ideas. In other words, like, we can preach like crazy and maybe win a person or two to Christ, but if we've lost the whole culture, then the preaching doesn't resonate with anything within culture, right? So what I'm asking us to do is consider how to create a culture in which resonance is possible. Can I suggest, and I get this from a guy by the name of Jamie Smith, but can I suggest that I do believe that, well, I don't know if I have to write this down, but we do become what we believe, right? So if we believe certain things, we'll become that way, right? I mean, I don't know, if we believe eating healthy is good for us, we'll start eating healthy. If we believe that Christ desires holiness in our life, we'll kind of move in that direction. But can I submit to you that, yes, we become what we believe, for doctrine matters, but we also become what we behold, and we're constantly beholding things. The only question is, what are we creating in culture for us to behold, right? In other words, I think we're more shaped by our senses and our heart than we are by our rational thoughts. So you guys are walking down the hall, the mall or somewhere, and like before you even come upon the store, you begin to smell their particular scent, cologne, whatever, and also hear the waves crashing, and then eventually you see the big jumbotron that shows the beach, right? And you already know you're at Hollister because Hollister decides that the way for you to buy more of their clothes is not putting up a poster, 10 more reasons you should shop at Hollister. That's rational, that's hitting the mind. But they decide that giving you the experience and the scent, the scene, right, the feel of being at the beach will make you want to buy another pair of shorts or a tank or whatever, and therefore convince you subconsciously that doing so will make you feel more like a surfer or surfer girl or whatever. You get the idea, right? Not exactly, but Hollister marketers are better social psychologists because they understand how now they have believers, so to speak. They have followers because they got the heart rather than just giving you doctrine. So the doctrine matters. What we believe shapes what we become. But what we behold, and we're beholding a lot of things globally on Instagram and so forth, what we behold shapes who we become too. And so why not create a culture in which we're beholding true, good, and beautiful things? Yeah, Josh. What's the distinction? Yeah, that's great questions. I think beliefs largely irrational, right? So that has to do with our thinking through things, our reading through things, are being preached to with rational messages or whatever, right? Our beholding things literally are through our senses. It's what we look at, right? It's what we, all our bodily senses touch the heart in a way that the mind kind of just stays up here. Okay, so I'll just reference the book now. The guy name is James K.A. Smith, right? He teaches at Calvin College. I can't get it verbatim, but in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, and he is a Christian, okay? And he teaches at Calvin. He's actually for the church, but he's trying to get the church to wake up a little bit to this fact. He says, this is kind of a provocative way of putting it, but he says, while Victoria's Secret and Jerry Bruckheimer is fanning a flame of lust in our cardia, our heart, the church is trucking waters of doctrine to our minds, hoping to douse the flame. It's a powerful image, right? Here's what he's saying. While Victoria's Secret, I don't know, maybe envy for some women, maybe lust for men, and Jerry Bruckheimer's CSI or whatever, all the machismo and so on and so forth, while these are creating visions of lust in our cardia, our heart, the church says, here, memorize 5 more things in the catechism, and then you'll become a better person, when in fact the battle is here, not here. Now, it doesn't mean doctors don't matter, don't take Theo 201 or whatever. No, obviously not. Like, they both matter. But maybe the church can recapture the liturgical tradition that we've had for 2,000 years, and that's why the last 3 chapters we'll look at in the book is on liturgy. Maybe the church can recapture the fact that we're embodied beings, and our eyeballs, right, and our heart is moved by the things that we're literally taking in, and that often shapes us more than 5 more doctrines why you should be holy. That makes sense? So that's the idea. Jeremiah 29:7 says, seek the welfare of the city and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Here's Renee Zellweger, who's not a Christian. I actually asked Rob, is she a Christian or whatever, right? She is not, but that's okay, because wherever truth is to be found, it belongs to its man. All truth is God's truth. Here's what she said on the red carpet. She's on the red carpet. She's wearing this very wholesome-looking dress. And the interviewers actually used that phrase. She said, Renee, interesting dress. What's up with the wholesomeness? And Renee comes back to her and says, well, I thought Hollywood could use some wholesomeness. And then she walks away. She didn't preach a sermon, but she just gave, I don't know, 40 million, 14-year-olds in America or around the world globally to see a vision of modesty and beauty done well. And now you're seeking the welfare of the city, right? And now the gospel makes more sense than it did prior to that little exchange, in a sense. Not completely, but we're moving people closer to the kingdom with every tweet, with every post we put on Instagram. And you and I have anywhere from 30 to 30,000 followers, right? I'm closer to the other side than, okay, whatever, right? But I think I told you guys that my secret ambition, so to speak, is actually to make Jess the most followed person on Instagram. Because I found out that Selena Gomez was one day, like a year ago, I found out, oh, supposedly she's the most followed. Okay, that's interesting. But no offense to Selena Gomez, but I mean, some of the things she put out isn't exactly wholesome. Let's just put it that way. So I said to Jess, Jess, my secret mission is to make you the most followed person on Instagram, because you embody what it means to do beauty and modesty well. Here's what, you guys remember, she's the one whose talk in New York went viral. She did the evolution of the swimsuit. And her whole mantra is, she and I both don't like the word modesty per se, because it sounds like old-fashioned and frumpy or whatever. But in essence, that's her mission, is to make beauty modest again. And so she's started with the swim line, right? And she did all that, and now she moved into a whole fashion thing called Ray. It's called just by Jessica Ray. So that's her thing. But because she embodies not just like physical beauty, but in terms of like, I've got inner beauty that I value because I do follow Christ, that's something that she's putting out here and there on Instagram, and I would want to see reverberated in the same way Renee Zellweger did, but even though she's not a Christian, right? It's a long answer to the question, but it says Jeremiah 29:7, seek the welfare of the city, and then find your gifting and calling so that you can be the Jessica Ray or whatever of your field, of the place to which God has called you.
You know, I think a lot of Christians, a lot of conservative Christians have come back from Hollywood like the other 10 that go with Joshua and say, no, the giants are too big. We can't do that. And so there's a lack of conservative money. There's a lack of Christian money to fuel and fund these things and train. And there's very few people that are actively trying to engage culture. I mean, Phil Anschutz is a conservative, and still at Walden Media is probably the only one that's active and visible, trying to make product that is infecting the culture in a good way. So I think, you know, it's you know, even in music, you know, Christian artists that try to cross over and to be mainstream get vilified by the Christian community.
Yeah, right.
You know,
Yeah.
which is more, you appreciate more that U2 starts the opposite way. It tries to find stuff that has a mainstream value to it. Oh no, by the way, here's what we believe.
Right.
Oh, by the way, this is what the streets, you know, have no name. This is what this is about.
Right, yeah. That's good.
Because they make stuff that is excellent, that's compelling, and sometimes people are shocked to find out who they are. Now, 30, 40 years, you know who they are by now, but at the beginning, you didn't know. And it didn't matter to them. What it mattered is they were creating music and art, and I think that's what we're built and made to do, and we should be doing that and do it for a wide audience, and we should engage, and oh, by the way, we do it because of this.
Yeah, right. That's excellent. Yeah, Bach and these folks, they didn't make lyrics with Jesus in them because they didn't have lyrics. They just made excellent music and let it speak for itself.
Yeah.